What would you do if the person you loved collapsed not because of illness alone, but because the weight of debt, loss, and silent fear had finally crushed him more completely than any fever ever could? By the time the late afternoon light slipped through the curtain and drew pale gold lines across the bed, Jack was no longer lying on the freezing bathroom floor where his strength had abandoned him. He had been carried upstairs, laid beneath a clean blanket, and rescued from that humiliating place where a man's private despair had finally become visible. Outside the room, the world still held its ordinary shape. The house remained standing. The wind still brushed past the old windows. Somewhere below, the kettle had boiled, footsteps had passed, and distant phones had continued to ring. But inside that room, something had changed. A body had fallen. Yes. Yet what truly broke was the fragile illusion that he could keep carrying everything alone. When Jack opened his eyes, the first thing he felt was not pain. It was the coolness of a hand resting against his forehead, a hand steady enough to quiet panic. A hand gentle enough to say, without ceremony, that he had not been left to face his collapse by himself. Tu Tien sat beside him, her face still marked by the shock of the morning. She had seen him unconscious. She had felt that terrifying instant when a strong man suddenly became frighteningly still. And since then, she had not moved far from his side. In her hands was a bowl of hot scallion porridge, sending up thin curls of steam into the fading light. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, almost restrained by the fear that still lingered beneath it. She only told him that it was good he was awake. Nothing more. No accusation, no dramatic grief. Just relief wrapped in exhaustion. And somehow that made the moment hurt even more. Because what had driven Jack to this bed was not a single disaster, but the slow tightening of many invisible ropes. For days, perhaps for longer than even he wanted to admit, he had been living under the pressure of two losses that cut deeper than numbers on paper. The car had already been sold. The land was still bound to the bank, hanging over him like a verdict he had delayed but never escaped. Those were not just material things. In a village life where every possession held effort inside it, a car was labor made visible, and land was dignity pressed into soil. To lose one and fear losing the other was not merely financial pain. It was the kind of humiliation that made a man lower his eyes in his own home. It was the kind of burden that hollowed the body from within, while forcing the face to pretend everything was still manageable. That was the cruel thing about Jack's suffering. It had not arrived with noise. It had come in the form of restless nights, unfinished meals, long silences, and the dull ache of constant calculation. He had walked through the house as though nothing were wrong, but his shoulders had carried the strain of someone already drowning. He had answered calls, spoken in measured tones, held together the surface of daily life. Yet inside him, worry had been eroding judgment, sleep, appetite, and pride. The fever was only the body's final surrender. His collapse in the bathroom had simply exposed what had already been happening in secret. Tu Tien, perhaps more than anyone, understood that some disasters never announce themselves properly. They gather in the body first. In the way a man sits too long without speaking. In the way his tea goes cold beside him. In the way he stares at nothing after hanging up the phone. She had seen these signs, though maybe not in their full danger. That morning, when she found him unconscious, the fear that surged through her was not the theatrical fear of losing a man in some grand accident. It was rawer, more intimate, more terrifying. It was the fear of realizing that the person beside you has been suffering alone while standing right in front of you. She had called for help in a rush, her voice trembling in spite of her effort to stay composed. Someone came. Jack was carried upstairs. Wet towels were brought. Medicine was found. The floor was cleaned, the panic pressed down, the house kept quiet, and then the long work began. Not dramatic work, Not heroic in the way stories usually celebrate, just the patient labor of care. All that day, Tu Tien stayed near him. She changed the cold towel on his forehead when the heat returned. She adjusted the blanket when his body shivered. She checked the medicine, cooled the porridge, watched the rise and fall of his breathing. When calls from the company came one after another, she answered them for him, her voice respectful but firm, creating a wall between his weakness and the outside demands waiting to consume him again. There was something deeply moving in that image. A woman seated at the edge of a sickbed, one hand handling the calls of business, the other smoothing a cloth against a fevered brow. In that small room, romance had already changed shape. It was no longer found in sweet words or gentle teasing. It had become responsibility, protection, quiet competence under pressure. And perhaps this was the most beautiful truth buried in that difficult day. Love, when tested by ordinary suffering, reveals its actual substance. Anyone can speak tenderness in peaceful weather. Anyone can make promises when the table is full and the future feels generous. But when debt enters the room, when shame takes hold of the heart, when the body gives out under invisible strain, then love must become useful. It must answer phone calls. It must cook porridge. It must sit through the long, silent hours when the sick person cannot even offer gratitude in return. Jack, lying there between sleep and waking, could see that truth more clearly than ever. The financial storm still existed. The debt had not vanished. The land was still under the bank. The sold car had not rolled back into his life out of pity. Nothing practical had been solved by fever. And yet, strangely, the burden in his chest began to lighten. Not because his losses were small, but because he was no longer carrying them in emotional isolation. For a proud man, that realization can be almost unbearable. There is a particular sorrow in recognizing that the person beside you has been giving more than you allowed yourself to see. Jack had been so consumed by the arithmetic of survival that he had reduced life to threats and deadlines. He had looked at the car and seen failure. He had looked at the land and seen danger. He had looked at the future and seen only a shrinking tunnel. But now, as the fever loosened its grip and the room settled into evening quiet, another truth emerged with painful clarity. Property could be lost, money could disappear, plans could collapse. Even a man's pride could be dragged through the dirt. But the one person who stayed by his side through that humiliation was not something the bank could seize, not something the market could price, not something misfortune had the right to take for granted. That insight did not come as a loud revelation. It came slowly, in fragments. In the sound of her setting down the bowl, in the sight of her fingers pinching the edge of the towel before replacing it, in the tiredness around her eyes, proof that she had spent the day watching him instead of resting herself. In the way she kept the room calm, as if protecting not only his body, but his dignity. There is dignity, too, in the way some women care for the men they love. Not a submissive dignity, not a silent self-erasure, but the dignity of restraint. Tu Tien did not use Jack's weakness to lecture him. She did not ask why he had hidden his suffering so long. She did not force him to speak before he had the strength. She did not pile emotional demands on top of physical collapse. Instead, she chose a harder and nobler path. She stayed. She made herself useful. She let her actions speak first. And that choice mattered because Jack's pain was not only financial, it was moral. He had wanted to protect the household, to keep burdens away from her, to remain the one who solved problems rather than becoming one. In many men, that instinct becomes both love and prison. The wish to protect turns into secrecy. Secrecy becomes loneliness. Loneliness becomes collapse. He had likely believed that if he spoke too plainly of the debt, the sold car, the land in danger, then he would no longer look like someone worthy of trust. But in falling, he learned the humiliating mercy of being seen at his weakest and not being abandoned. Evening deepened. The house grew quieter. The last of the light thinned across the wall. The fever began to break, leaving behind that peculiar stillness that follows a day of physical suffering. It is never quite peace. It is a tired, fragile truce between the body and whatever had been tormenting it. Jack's skin had cooled. His breathing had steadied. The room no longer felt like a place of emergency. It felt like a place where something essential had been laid bare. Tu Tien remained beside him, though the urgency had lessened. Perhaps she was finally allowing herself to breathe. Perhaps the shock of the morning was only now settling into her bones. There are moments when fear does not show itself until after the danger has passed. One imagines that she looked at him then not only with concern, but with the quiet hurt of someone who had almost lost more than she knew. And Jack, seeing her there, finally reached for her hand. It was such a small action. No grand declaration, no dramatic apology. Just a hand closing around hers in the half-dark quiet of a room that had held both panic and care. Yet that gesture contained more honesty than many speeches ever could. It said that he understood. It said that he had felt her presence through the fever. It said that, whatever storms still waited outside that room, he no longer wanted to face it from behind the wall of pride that had nearly destroyed him. In stories like these, one often waits for some sudden rescue, some miracle that resolves the debt and restores what was lost. But life is rarely so theatrical. The more meaningful turning point is often inward. It happens when a man who has been measuring his worth by what he can keep finally realizes that he is not only loved when he is successful. It happens when a woman proves, through ordinary devotion, that partnership is not built for sunny days alone. It happens when suffering transforms romance into something humbler and stronger. That night did not erase Jack's problems. Morning would still come with obligations, with numbers, with consequences. There would still be difficult decisions ahead, perhaps painful ones. The land issue would not vanish because he had been cared for tenderly. The sold car would remain a wound. But now there was a different kind of strength in the room, not the brittle strength of denial, not the lonely strength of pretending. Something steadier, the strength of being accompanied, and that is what makes the scene so moving. Not the fever itself, not even the collapse, but the moral shift hidden within it. Jack had spent so much energy fearing what might be taken from him that he had almost failed to see what remained. Tu Tien, by sitting beside him all day, by carrying the work he could not do, by feeding him, cooling him, shielding him from the world's demands, Gilprasas gave him more than comfort. She restored proportion to his heart. She reminded him that a life is not measured only by possessions retained, but by the hands that refuse to let go when fortune turns cruel. In the quiet after suffering, people sometimes discover what they should have known all along. Jack discovered that a true companion is not an ornament of good days, but a shelter in collapse. Tu Tien discovered that care is sometimes strongest when spoken in the simplest gestures. And together, without announcing it, they crossed from the softer territory of affection into the deeper ground of shared endurance. That is why the ending of such a moment feels bittersweet rather than triumphant. There is no loud victory here, no easy solution, only a man weakened by fear, a woman worn by worry, and a room briefly made holy by tenderness. Yet, in that modest setting, something emotionally mature took root. Love stopped being merely a feeling and became a decision renewed through action. Dignity was no longer the pride of standing alone, but the courage to accept care. And hope was no longer the fantasy that nothing would be lost, but the quieter faith that even loss could be survived if two people chose not to turn away from each other. Perhaps that is the hardest and most beautiful truth of all. Love is not truly proven when life is generous. It is proven when shame enters the house, when silence grows heavy, when the future narrows, and one person still sits at the bedside with a bowl of hot porridge, a cool hand, and the patience to remain. In the end, money can vanish, property can slip away, and the plans people build can collapse without warning. But the one who stays, who serves, who protects, without making the wounded person feel smaller, that is the one who turns hardship into something almost bearable. And sometimes, in the middle of financial ruin and fever, that quiet kind of love becomes the only wealth that truly saves a life.